and it will be about a different mark making tool each week. I do pencils and pens, and I'll even do electronic tablet sketching and drawing. And I'll talk a little about history, a little about some of the people that are really good, and we'll look at really good examples of the art and do a little bit of demonstration too. Probably prepare a handout for each one.
That sounds interesting.
It keeps me busy all week doing these things. Unless I just put it off till the last minute, and then it does.
I was monitoring our Facebook Live session with AARP, and Dustin Etheridge was speaking about brain health and how important it is to keep doing new things and art and learning new methods. And I think all of y'all are doing a great job of keeping your brain healthy and doing this. Yeah. So congrats to all of y'all. And to Ken for instructing the class.
Yeah. Anytime you're out or even around your house, you start looking at things and looking at, well, how can I make an interesting composition out of that? And it just kind of keeps your brain going and gives you a different way of looking at your world. I know it can look the same. Our house is looking kind of the same these days. It's been out a lot.
But I've decided there's different kinds of people in life. There's people who like to redecorate all the time, and then there's people who set a pattern and then that's it. And I'm in that second camp where once it's set, it's fine.
When you get it just right, how can you change perfection? You know?
Exactly.
It just can't happen. You should see my chair in the living room. I have this little swivel rocker, and on one side I have a table, and I have a little special container for brushes and pencils and pens, and a basket for my sketchbooks underneath. And then behind me I have another table, and it has these rows of drawers with pencils and pens and everything I need. I just swivel around. I don't have to get up.
I can show everybody.
And just one more thing, Judy, I noticed that you're here. I'm sorry if I didn't notice you earlier yet.
But Barbara, hi.
Yeah, hi. I was thinking of getting like a drafting table. I've seen one that I like, and you can paint on it, you can raise it and lower it. Is that something that I should look into, or is that a waste of money?
No, not at all. I mean, I worked on mine for years. I still got it right over here next to me. And yeah, I paint on it all the time. Whenever I want to do anything serious, I come over to my table.
I got this.
Very often. Yeah, that's great.
Okay, thanks. I will go ahead and do it then.
That must fit in your lap, Doris. That must be really
This is a, it's for a computer, either your computer or for the keyboard.
Yeah.
Adjusts to different heights, and you put it on the table or wherever you are.
Sure.
And it folds down. I mean,
yeah.
So
yeah, something like that's really convenient.
And then I have a piece of board that I put on it.
Yeah.
Doris, where'd you get that?
Oh, it's a long time ago, but either at one of the office supply stores or Amazon. I mean, just look in computer supplies. But it's very adjustable. It's very light. It doesn't take up any room. This one holds my keyboard. I just take it from the and it comes to I'm in my kitchen.
Sure.
Can you use it on your lap?
Well, it's not straight on the bottom, but I suppose you could put it on a pillow or on another, something softer. Because it doesn't weigh much. Look, and it's mesh, so it's really good for the computers because then it doesn't it gives it air. But when Ken started saying use things at an angle, because I've been just doing pencil, this really I thought of this first before going out and buying anything more, because I've already spent a fortune on paper.
Sure.
So it goes like that, see?
Yeah, that's just fine.
Yeah.
But it is 10:02, so I'm going to mute everyone and then ask Ken to unmute himself so he can go ahead and give instructions.
I'm ready. Some slides. I wanted to talk more about what we didn't finish up last week. me get my screen share thing here. There we go. That one. Share it. Slideshow. Slideshow. Okay, we're off. This is part 2 of what we started yesterday or last week, and we're going to talk about mixing these colors, and then we're going to get into some other things, of course. Just a little bit of a recap on these color mixings. There's no pure hues, except cobalt blue is very close. It's very close to a pure blue, and about as close as you might get. But most colors will lean one direction or another. If you get a red, it might have quite a bit of yellow in it, like a cadmium red, and be very warm feeling, or you might have something like an alizarin crimson. It has a lot of blue in it, and it'll feel cool. So most colors are like that, even yellow, which is probably the least of them. You still get very greenish yellows and very orangey yellows, certainly. So that's how we mix our paint using that. And we'll look at some things. Another thing I didn't talk about much was whites. And this is very confusing for a lot of people because you get a white in your color boxes when you buy one a lot of times. And invariably, it's Chinese white. This is just really comes from a long tradition. This was the first white. And when it first was invented, and came out in England in the 1860s or 50s, I believe. People were lined up at art stores to buy this. It was just really the thing. But it's not terribly opaque. You can mix nice pastel colors with it. You can put on some gauzy kind of highlights that would look something like, you know, that gauzy white stuff on grapes. You wanted to paint it over a grape, you could make a grape look very realistic like that. But it's not good for covering things up. To cover things, you need titanium white. It's very opaque. Also, the Chinese white, by the way, is zinc white. They're both exactly the same thing, 2 different names. But titanium is much whiter. You can get zinc white, Chinese white, titanium white watercolor. But I would recommend just getting a tube of titanium white gouache. It's also called permanent gouache, things like that. It's a little cheaper and works just as well. You can also get some FW opaque white ink, and it's really much the same thing, and is actually even more opaque, I think, than the gouache or watercolors, but I've not used it. The gouache works fine for me. And really, I'm talking about this more than masking fluid and things. Masking fluid, especially when you're beginning, is just another encumbrance to get in your way and to deal with. You can use tape, too, that will mask things out, but you can just paint your whites back. If you've lost your white, just paint it back in with some white gouache. It's really about the simplest, quickest thing you can do. And here's an example, my little pointer here. You can see these white flowers. Well, by making this darker green background for them, I can really make these come out. This is just little blobs of white gouache, and I put a little yellow center in them. Very quickly, you can do this. The other way to do it, of course, would be with masking fluid or little round pieces of tape, or it's scraping it out. But you know, the gouache is so simple to do that not a problem. I've done several other things on this painting, and we'll talk about each of them later on. But we've got dry brush going on, scraping out, lifting out, just quite a number of little techniques that will make the paintings more interesting that we'll get into. Okay, there's white gouache for corrections. Remember I talked about that last week? This whole area here was painted in white gouache from about here right down through here. And then with that white gouache, I also mixed in just a little bit of quinacridone gold to give it this yellowy color here. By the way, quinacridone gold, raw sienna, they're pretty similar in color if you're wondering about that sort of thing. So it's really useful for corrections and even major changes. I do a lot with it. Useful colors. These are colors I find useful. You may not. It really, everyone has their own choices on this, but this is what I'm currently using. It changes it from time to time. But you can see I've got 3 blues here. I'm using ultramarine, which is a very warm blue, lots of red in it. You can get French ultramarine, by the way, which is even redder. If you're wanting an even warmer blue than the ultramarine, then French ultramarine would be your next step that direction. Cerulean blue is kind of a greeny blue, and it granulates very well, and it's kind of opaque a bit. As you can see, this means the darker this little circle is, the more opaque it is, by the way. So this one is transparent. This one's sort of semi-opaque. I also use cobalt blue, which is semi-opaque, although it seems really much more transparent than cerulean. Greens we'll get into more. Here are a couple of my favorites: sap green, purulene. I also use deep sap green. All 3 of these are Daniel Smith. Cobalt teal is just a color I like. I like to put it in the sky, add some kind of nice color to the sky. Looks good with cobalt violet. And I just put it here and there sometimes for the heck of it. My yellow, I use Hansa yellow. I don't really have a lemon yellow to speak of. I use, consider the quinacridone gold, although it looks really orangey in this swatch here. That's because it's really thick put on there. When you just put a light coat on, it's almost as yellow as the Hansa yellow. I also use Naples yellow a lot. I put Naples yellow in the sky because, for one thing, it doesn't turn as green as other yellows if you put blue over it. It kind of holds its own. And it has a creamy kind of a color, a tad bit of orange. I like the Winsor Newton brand on this. It's not quite as orange as some of the others, and it suits me best. Goethite brown is a Daniel Smith color, and it's just a nice sort of warm brown. It's not yellow ochre, which I do use too. But it's very similar to raw umber of Winsor Newton. You can hardly tell them apart. So these colors, you just really have to try them or see them. Here's my raw umber from Daniel Smith. This is really a nice dark brown, almost a sepia, very useful color. My burnt sienna is Da Vinci, like I said. I really like Da Vinci's burnt sienna. It's just right for me because it will mix this gray that you see down here in the corner. That's ultramarine blue and burnt sienna, and I just mix it up with a toothpick in my pans and use it. Sometimes if it's not thoroughly mixed, it'll be a little warmer and sometimes a little cooler. And you just add a little more ultramarine or a little more burnt sienna to get exactly the color of gray that you want. For a warm red, I use Pyrrole Scarlet. It is almost indistinguishable from vermilion. Very similar to that. Those are Daniel Smith. Cadmium red, light or medium would work just as well. And for a cool red, I use Permanent Alizarin Crimson. Probably use this 10 times more than the Pyrrole Scarlet. I don't use warm red hardly ever, for some reason. Other useful colors, you might like an Indanthrone if you want a navy blue or blue jeans blue, denim blue. That works well, but I don't use it that much anymore. I use an Imperial Purple from Daniel Smith. Undersea Green we'll talk about. There's a Yellow Ochre, very useful color. Yellow Ochre will neutralize about any color and kind of knock it down so it doesn't look so artificial. Very useful for that. Viridian and Phthalo Green, although these two look a little different, the green, the blue shade of Phthalo Green and Viridian look identical. I use the Viridian because it's weaker and doesn't stain as much. Phthalo colors really stain and can be a problem. There's the deep sap green I talked about. This is really a nice shadow color for grasses and just a variation on sap green that I kind of like to use quite a bit in mixes. Buff titanium is actually, again, titanium white gouache, essentially, only it's been cooked a little bit, so it's brown, and very useful for making sand and stone colors, and a lot of things end up in a little bit of buff titanium in it for me. Prussian blue can be mixed with this burnt umber and make really beautiful greens, by the way. It kind of really takes over a picture, though. You really have to watch out using Prussian blue. They can, in the sky or anything, it can just sort of permeate the whole thing. It'll unify your pictures, certainly. This English red earth is very similar to what I use. I actually use Winsor Newton light red, and it's maybe a little oranger than that, but not much difference at all. Really a useful color. Where you might use burnt sienna, you can use this. It's really great for autumn colors. Purely maroon, I go on and off of this color. It's a deep, dark red. Really works good for some of the shrubberies you see around Little Rock that are that reddish color. Burnt umber, I use Winsor Newton. I don't like the Daniel Smith burnt umber as well. It just doesn't seem to have the color complexity I like. Quinacridone rose makes beautiful purples when you mix it with ultramarine. If you're doing flower paintings, you'd love this color. And quinacridone burnt orange has a lot of uses. I find more all the time. I'm really getting where I like that color. It works really well in shadows, believe it or not. Okay, mixing two colors again. Do it directly on the paper at times. I guess what I want to really emphasize is don't overmix your paints. A lot of times something happens to your paints when you just swirl them around like an egg beater until they're thoroughly, completely mixed. They just sort of are less interesting when you put them on the paper. Just swirl it around enough to get the color you want and then put it on the paper, or just put them on the paper and put another color on while it's still wet right on top of it, swirl them together. You can be pretty loose with this and actually end up looking better than if you try and really get a complete mix. So don't overdo it. So now let's talk about mixing grays. This is really one of the more important mixes that you make, and you generally make it mixing complements, about the easiest way to mix a gray. You can mix, three primaries or three different colors about equal distance around the color wheel. But when you start mixing three colors, most of the time it just gets to be a pain. I'd much rather just mix two and not worry about it so much. Much easier to do. And here's some in use. Notice I've used these. I mixed a lot of grays and neutrals in this picture over on the left. It's this tower. I put very cool grays in the background in the sky. And when we get to the stonework, as we get progressively closer, I'm making warmer grays. So we have warm here and then really warm right here under this little triangle. And then actually browns in this wall and little bits of gray down in here, but very warm. And that warm colors advance, come forward, and cool colors go back. And so this adds depth to that little painting. I've done much the same over here. Notice I didn't even paint the tombstones here in this painting. I thought that would distract from what I was really wanting to sketch, was this cathedral run. I've got warm green grass down here, which brings that forward. And we have very cool sky colors up here, but cooler down towards the bottom than towards the top. Down here, I made it very dark, as you can see, to kind of tie that into the ground and everything. And there's generally more shadow the farther down a building you get, so it's usually a bit darker anyway. Notice because of that, I made the sky darker so the building would be tonally lighter and so stand out in front of that sky. As we get up higher up here, notice I've made this tower darker and made the sky lighter so that the tower would stand out. That's called counter change. And you can do that, and it's very subtle, but it will really be effective in your painting. So mixing grays, here is just a number that I have made. Some that I use commonly, some I don't, just because some are so easy to use. Burnt umber and ultramarine blue are kind of the go-to gray most people like to use, but there are just many other ways to do it. The burnt umber will give you a nice neutral gray, maybe blacker. I kind of like it in skies sometimes. The burnt sienna you know, you can really adjust the warmth and coolness of it by alternating these two colors. And so it's really useful. Probably if I had to just pick one, that's what I would use. But there's so many ways you can do this. And sometimes you don't get what you think you will. Like phthalo blue and burnt orange you think would make gray, but you can get a really nice green out of that. So sometimes it'll surprise you. All in all, I haven't had a lot of luck mixing grays with the quinacridone burnt orange. You can get them, but generally you get a brown. It's such a warm dye color. This is a very important gray here, the Viridian or phthalo green with permanent alizarin crimson. You get a very cold gray. Even the reds look cold, and the greens particularly. They're very interesting. They make really nice gray greens and foliage. It's a good one to use. If you want an opaque gray, Indian red and cerulean blue are really nice. And it's a really soft opaque gray, a very pleasant color to use on that. Others, you know, I've tried lots of them. I like purulene green and dioxazine violet. These will mix a neutral gray like you see here, but also they will make a black. You can just go completely black with this. Or you get very deep greens, very deep purples. If any of you have seen a lot of my paintings where there's lots of deep greens and purples in the background, well, that's usually what I'm using. Purulene green on its own, too much will look kind of flat though. I think it's got some black pigment in it as well. Let's see if I can just switch my screen share here. Stop share. Okay, now I'm going to try and paint, see what happens. And I'll do a little mix here get out my number 10 brush, and I'm going to mix. First, I'll start with my ultramarine blue. I'm just going to do it on the paper. Got it wet here. You can see that. I may have to, can't get that down a little lower. I can go all the way down. Okay. There we are. Okay. Now you can see that's a nice patch of ultramarine. Now before it dries, I'm cleaning out my brush, grabbing some burnt sienna, a lot of that, start putting it into it. Now put it over on the side so we can just bring some of this blue into it till it gets to the gray I want. I took it all there. There we go. Now that's still pretty warm gray. I'll smoothe it out so you can see it better. Like that. I can add blue to it, whoa, and cool it down. And you can see it gets darker. And you can do this in your mixing plate too. Probably should do that. I can put my little plate right here. And we can do these things. See if I can't get some of this Viridian out and show you a nice, yeah, that's green. Viridian's kind of a tough color. It's good to pre-wet it because it's kind of hard and it's a weak color to begin with. Okay, I've got a lot of Viridian there. I'll rinse my brush again, try and keep my paints reasonably clean. I got a little alizarin crimson right over here. And I'm going to put it to the side. When we mix our paints, it's good to put it to the side and then bring one into the other until we get the color we want. This alizarin crimson is really a lot stronger than the Viridian, so I'm going to bring a little of it in. There we go. Now you can see that Viridian starting to get very gray. There's really a nice neutral right there. But we can add a little more red to it and see that warm up. And you can just keep on doing that and adjusting that however you want to do it. So that works really well like that. And that's how I would mix it if I'm painting. I would bring these two colors together until I got what I wanted. And then I would put it on my paper and use it. I like a plate like that or a butcher block, but I also use, you know, porcelain palettes or anything handy to do it. There's of course room on this palette to mix, but I always have it so dirty that I don't use it. Another good thing is right next to your water jar, next to your mixing palette, have either a paper towel or have it sitting on a rag or something so that you can wipe your brush on. I have a rag right under mine so I can just wipe it as I finish off here. So now we're going back to screen share. Let's see how this works. I've always, yeah, good. Share that. Wow, Okay, get back to my slideshow. Slideshow, current slide. Okay. And I want to talk about shadows briefly. And check my time too. Okay, we are, gosh, I go slow. Okay, shadows, what I want to say is you can use complements, like if it's green, you can put in red, but it's easier probably to just use blue because the shadows also are coming from a lot of skylight and a lot of blue light. And so you can use blue down here. If you want to warm it up, you can use purple. See, this is a very warm blue or a purple on these columns. On vertical surfaces, it's good to kind of mix a warm purplish. On flat surfaces, under the sun, on this green grass, you want it bluer. And if you'll look underneath this eave, it's not blue or purple at all. Underneath, it's orange and yellow. The reason is yes.
In your slideshow, there's a little box that says resume slideshow. If you want to click that, right now we still see your thumbnails and that'll make your slide bigger.
Oh, I'm sorry. I forgot to do that.
That's okay. Thank you.
There we go.
You did a great job.
Okay, here, see how orangey yellow this is? This is reflected light from this grass going up under here. And so when you've got these eaves, you don't necessarily want to put them all in shadow. Put a little bit of reflected light under those and they'll look a lot nicer and warmer. You see them right next to these columns underneath here as well. So think orange on underneath sides, think blue on the ground, and think violet colors on vertical surfaces. And that's a general rule. Don't feel you have to follow that strictly at all. You can go even light grays. You may want it very cold for the winter. So lots of things you can try on shadows. You can also throw in some color. See this burnt orange, quinacridone burnt orange in this shadow? It just really brightens things up. There's no reason for that to be there. If you were looking at this scene, you wouldn't necessarily see that. But if you put it in, it just adds some sparkle and life to that shadow that wouldn't ordinarily be there. And shadows aren't always the same color. They vary within the shadow quite a bit. So, another way to look at that, here I have used on this painting, I've used cool colors on the back side of this dome. And as it moves toward the light, I've brought in violets as it warms up. That makes this dome turn from the receding dark colors to the warm colors in front and just adds more depth to it that way. Notice in this very dark area here, I've used a dark blue down towards the bottom and underneath these arches. And that helps it recede and look deeper and less flat. So we'll move on to that. Mixing greens. One thing I didn't talk about last week is Payne's Gray. Payne's Gray makes great greens, especially with quinacridone gold. Very useful. But also with yellows, it's very good for that. And again, Prussian blue makes great greens with any kind of yellow. I want to say that quinacridone gold and raw sienna are very similar colors, in case you're wondering. That's one reason I use quinacridone gold is it doesn't get as crumbly. It'll stay in a palette for years, and raw sienna just sort of gets crumbly and very hard to use. So that's one of my main reasons for not using it so much. These are the greens I find useful for mixing, and we've talked about those. Viridian and the phthalo are interchangeable. It's just that, see, phthalo is a number 4 on the stain. You can't lift it out of the paper once it's dry. Viridian is a number 1. You can do a lot of lifting. So that's the main difference there. These are great green colors. You can use them on their own, but it's always best to mix them down a little bit. Even with sap green, you know, put a touch of burnt sienna in it or even a touch of red to kind of knock it down so it looks more realistic. It only takes a very minor bit of any kind of a red color. I use light red a lot for that, but burnt sienna will work just as well. And there's my chart of mixed greens. You've already got that. The ones I got to check by are ones I use a lot. I find them useful. There's a nice spring green there with a phthalo or a viridian mixed with Hansa yellow, works well. With sap green, it's just a little, sap green has a bit of red in it, so you can see it's dulled down just a bit from what you get with these over here. What I like about Pyrrole Scarlet, Violet, Alizarin Crimson, and Purline Green is all these darks they make. They can go just almost completely black. And the same with Phthalo and Permanent Alizarin Crimson. You have to mix them fairly thick, you know, kind of creamy. You don't want to go straight from the tube, but you want to have a fairly dense paint mix. And also these make a nice gray-green, which is very useful for some leaf colors. So I go with those. And here's making them more interesting. This is a painting we did in David Cook's class from a Winslow Homer painting. And this is pretty much what the painting looked like when Winslow Homer painted it, from what I could see on the internet. And here's how I painted it. You can see I put more red in it down here, and it just kind of brightened it up and put it up into the sky to kind of tie it together, and put a lot of contrast right here, making this a focal point. I made white clouds here and a very dark shadow here. And that contrast is what really leads the eye to the focal point. So don't be afraid to go dark and very light with your colors. Flesh tones, these are the ones I use. Hopefully that's fairly explanatory. Naples yellow with a very small touch of permanent alizarin crimson will give you a nice beginning Caucasian flesh tone. A touch of burnt sienna in it, or ultramarine, and you've got the shadows. Very, very light burnt sienna will work on its own, by the way. Potter's pink will work on its own, but it's very granular, and to me it's just a little too pink for flesh tones. I don't really care for it that much. People used to use yellow ochre and burnt sienna for flesh yellow. Raw umber, if you want darker skin, raw umber is a good starting spot. And to add yellow ochre or Naples yellow to it, and ultramarine blue, or even phthalo green. And there's some mixes right there that you've already got. I won't go into that. And there's some paintings I did. What I want to mention about this picture of me is the 3 bands on a portrait. The lower part of a face, from say the bottom of the nose to the chin, is generally kind of bluish and cool. The mid region from the nose up to the brows here is generally kind of yellowish. And then from the top of the ears, right about there, up to the top of the head is generally kind of reddish in a portrait. That's just kind of a general rule to follow. A lot of people aren't aware of that when they do portraiture. Of course, a lot of people have a bright red nose too, like me. But, techniques useful. I'm glad I made pictures of this. Is scraping out is one very useful technique to use. And think of scraping out as plowing a muddy field. If the field was so wet that it was just a slurry, when you ran your plow through it, well, the mud and water would all just flow back into the ditch, and you wouldn't have a line. But if you let it dry enough, then when you run the plow through it, then the mud is thrown up on either side. And that's exactly how paint works. When you scrape it out, see how shiny it is on the right over here, or left? If you scrape that out, you get a dark line, which is fine. You may want a dark line. If you wait just till that sheen is off and then scrape it out, you'll get a white line. You'll push those pigments to the side. But you've got to wait, and you really got to time that. And it helps to make a little flick here and there until it gets just how you want it. But just as that sheen goes off is ideal for getting the white. So you got to really kind of practice that and look at it. And here's some examples. I call this the burning bush little picture. I put in a lot of things in here, some scraping out. Here I scraped out while it was wet, so I got a dark line. And here I scraped out just as it went out and get the white line. Here again, the same thing. Notice all of this is dry brush for the leaves around here. I've got that in your handout. Here's some water drops. I just dropped water on it and then damped it off with a paper towel. And this is a blotted cloud. While the sky was still wet, I just took some kitchen towel and blotted that up a little bit to make a bit of a cloud. Here's an example of blotting and lifting. Blotting is when it's wet, and I just damped a bunch out. And lifting, I use the magic sponge for that. And That's after it's completely dry. You wet your sponge, your magic sponge, and just wipe it through there however much you want. You can take it right, those magic sponges, you can dig a hole right through the paper if you wanted. But that's probably not the goal. So this explains that. Here's the dry brush technique. If you hold it vertically, that's what I use that hog hair brush for a lot. You get really nice tree texture. You can smash flat a round brush. If it's too wet, and it usually is too wet, dry it out, just run your fingers through it. It's what I do, but you can damp it out on a towel and then smash it down flat and drag it across the paper to get that rough look. It only touches the top tooth of the paper, so you don't get good coverage, and that's what you're looking for. I use a bristle brush held flat with very little paint on it. A lot of times I'll use thick paint, almost completely out of the tube paint on one side, wipe it off, and then drag it flat across. This is good for making water. So here is using that hog brush in a circular motion to make sky. I think it makes a real interesting sky. Very busy. If you had a busy foreground, you wouldn't want to do that. But if you've got a calm foreground, you can make a busy sky in the back. Here is using the brush vertically to make branches out of dry brush. Here is using a round brush with the hair spread out to make grass, just sweeping it up and down, both directions. If you go one direction, it'll look kind of flat along the bottom and not look correct. So we want to go both ways on that. That's a dry brush background. And this way we're going to paint this, and of course I've run out of time. We won't have time to do all this. I've given you a template for that, but you don't have to follow it. You can just make this up as you go. That's the whole idea on this. Just start with a color of green for this foliage in front here and work your way across. So while it's still wet, just throw in some blues or purples for shadows along the bottom, or maybe a purulene green. Mix it right on the paper. Add yellows to your green, add some light reds. That's what this is. Add some quinacridone gold, like here. Just touch in colors wherever you want, any color you want, and you'll make really interesting lines of foliage. Add some tree shapes in the background. Generally work from the back to the front. That's how this was painted. That's a general painting method. That's the way to go. Here is using that bristle brush on its vertical edge again, with a lot of different colors, just jabbing it around. Almost dry paint. I like to use pan paint and just sort of wet the tip of the brush and then jab it down in the paint pretty hard up and down, and it'll get kind of dryish paint on it. You can jab it down onto your paper in the same manner and let it spread out. It's pretty random, but it works fine. Remember to put shadows in your grasses and the foregrounds and things. Don't try and make your grass all one color. Throw in 3 or 4 colors. You can't have too many colors. Put every color you got if you want. But generally you want some darker colors at the base. You don't want everything starting, do a flicking motion of flicking up and you get a tip, flick down and you get a tip. By flicking down, you're making negative spaces for blades of grass in front, and it will look a lot better. I wish I had had time to demonstrate this. Some parting thoughts I wanted to leave you with is always use plenty of water in your washes. Don't try and use straight paint. It won't work. And have a big enough brush to cover the area you're working with. Don't go to a smaller brush until the biggest brush doesn't work any longer. Use them as long as you can before you go to a smaller size. Don't overwork your watercolor. Watercolor always looks best with as few strokes as possible. Otherwise, it looks like you've labored over it, and you probably have. I know I have when mine looks that way. But do that. And for the most part, don't ever try to paint over a damp and drying wash. It just almost always ruins it. Unless you're trying for a cauliflower effect, don't do this. Let it dry completely and then take off what you don't want, or let it dry completely and paint over it, but don't try and paint into it when it's in that damp. The sheen is off of it. If you need to paint into a damp one, then mist it with water and paint on it when it's refreshingly wet again. Keep it wet. Really look how your paint and water move on paper. Play with it. Do little tiny paintings. Don't do lots of big ones. And just watch what happens. Do 5-10 minute little paintings. Paint a tree. Paint a sky. And see what's going on with that really closely. And get to where you can control that movement of paint and water and feel confident that you can do that. So, end of show. End of class, I guess. I hope you've all enjoyed it. It's always fun for me to do this sort of thing. Am I upside right side up? I was afraid I'd turn upside down on this when I did that. Oh. See, I hadn't cut my hair in quite a while. Yeah, profile there from the sun, that didn't help at all. But anyway, what can I say? If there's questions, let me know. I'll try and answer them. You can always email me. I'm not going anywhere. So.
Hello?
Yes.
Ken, are you going to be teaching in the fall?
I will be teaching a class that will cover various aspects of drawing tools. Pencils and pens and fountain pens and even drawing with paint, watercolor.
Wonderful.
Fun thing to do.
Great.
I can look at things.
I'll just go ahead and let you know what day and time so you all can make sure not to schedule appointments then. It's going to be on Thursdays at 10 a.m. So he's changing from Wednesdays to Thursdays.
So hopefully it'll be fun and interesting. I'll have a lot of various things to show you and talk about. And, we'll have some demonstrations, hopefully, too.
Now, will Kenneth's classes from this last time and this time be on the website in forever?
Maybe not forever, but at least 3 years. And then after 5 years, when we go back to that page and go, oh yeah, why is that old stuff still there? Then we'll remove it. So we are going to be redesigning the website a little bit before the fall though, but there will be a page of where all the recordings from the spring and the summer term are all on one page is what we hope to do.
Kenneth, I wanted to tell you, thank you, but also I found that I stopped painting because I had bought a Strathmore journal, and I felt like, oh no, if I do something wrong, I'll mess up. So I got some of my old paper and just tore it out and started doing stuff on it, and that helped. So I want to thank you because this has really, really helped me.
Yeah. I paint on anything. I paint on printer paper sometimes. Just, it's not going to be your best watercolor, but that's okay. You can still see a lot of what's going on, and sometimes it turns out better than you think it might.
Doris has unmuted herself. I think she has a comment or question.
I just wondered if there was a separate handout for today's stuff.
Yes, there is. I think it's on the LifeQuest website, and I'll send everybody one too.
Okay.
It's not on the website yet because I'm trying to decide if I want to put stuff on there and then 2 days later move it all to a new page. This week is kind of tricky for me, but I'll upload the video for certain.
Yeah, as soon as we're finished here, I have a handout and I will email it to everybody. And also a PDF of this slide presentation too.
Yeah, that's great.
So you can go back over that and look at some of these techniques. I didn't have time. I was going to demonstrate all of them. I can tell each of my classes ought to be 2 hours.
Well, if you teach in the winter, maybe we can accommodate that. Just press the point and say, I need 2 hours.
It's about the truth. Well,
I hope you all have enjoyed this. I've certainly enjoyed listening to Ken and seeing you all very concentrated on whatever art you're doing. If you want to take a picture of your art and email it to the office, please do so, and we'll share it on our Facebook page and on our website. We would love to see what you've been working on this year. I would love to develop a page of quarantine art where whatever project you've been working on, be it watercolor, collages, knitting, whatever, send it to me and we can share that with everybody, because it's hard to share right now. And so however we can do it, I'm game. So thank you, Kenneth.
Yep.
Thank you,
Bye,
Ken.
everybody.
Thank you, Ken.
Bye, Ken. Thanks again.
Bye.